300 locomotives, nose to tail, stretching 3 miles across the Arizona desert. No crews, no trains attached, no movement at all. Just steel and silence and sand. Each one of these machines is worth $2 to $3 million. Together, they represent nearly $1 billion of American freight power doing absolutely nothing. And here's what makes this line so unsettling. They're not broken. They're not headed for scrap. They are waiting. And the reason they are waiting reveals something most people never see: the hidden logic, the financial stress, and the strategic gambles driving the freight system that holds this economy together. Parallel to Interstate 10, 45 miles southeast of Tucson, a single Union Pacific siding at milepost 1032 of the Lordsburg subdivision holds this silent assembly. It sits just outside the town of Benson, Arizona, accessed by a gravel stretch known as March Station Road. Here, the machines sit spaced only a few feet apart, creating a continuous wall of yellow steel. Satellite and aerial records show this formation began taking shape as early as July 2017. Rather than dispersing, the line has remained a constant fixture of the Sonoran Desert for years. Every unit in this 3-mile chain is a mainline heavy-haul workhorse. The roster is dominated by General Electric AC 4400 CW units pushing 4,400 horsepower and Electromotive Division SD70 ACE locomotives rated at 4,300 horsepower. These are the exact machines built to drag thousands of tons of freight across continental mountain passes. They are the backbone of high-capacity, long-distance rail shipping. A single modern diesel-electric locomotive of this class carries a market value of $2 to $3 million. When the physical count of these parked units approaches 300, the economic reality of the scene shifts from an industrial curiosity to a severe financial anomaly. The line represents $900 million of idle machinery. Even at a conservative valuation, more than $600 million of productive asset value sits completely frozen. For any Class 1 railroad, keeping $1 billion fleet of highly capable modern equipment offline is a choice that carries massive capital costs. It is a physical balance sheet parked in the sand, visible from orbit, completely silent, and waiting for an operational answer. To understand this silent wall of steel, look closer at the physical condition of the machines. The exhaust stacks are capped with custom, heavy-duty weatherproofing covers. Heavy plastic tarps are sealed tight over the main air intakes. The steel couplers are freshly greased, and the cab windows remain completely intact, showing no signs of desert vandalism, rust, or salvage stripping. Technicians make regular rounds here, applying rust inhibitor sprays, inspecting protective tarps, and performing basic engine checks to keep the systems viable. This is not a boneyard or a scrapyard. None of these engines have been cannibalized for parts, and none are marked for the demolition torch. Every detail reveals a deliberate, highly organized preservation effort. Union Pacific is holding this fleet in a state of suspended animation. This distinction shifts the core mystery. Instead of asking what went wrong to strand $1 billion of heavy machinery in the dry desert, we must ask what kind of operational system deliberately creates a 3-mile line of dormant giant workhorses. These locomotives sit in active waiting rather than passive decay. They represent a massive pool of latent horsepower, fully maintained under strict maintenance protocols, protected by security patrols, and kept ready to return to active service on short notice. The arid plain of Benson acts as an open-air warehouse. By parking these units here, the railroad retains a massive reserve of power, keeping its options open in a volatile freight market. This line is a corporate balance sheet made visible in the sand, a direct reflection of how the modern freight network manages its most capital-intensive assets. The silence of these engines represents a calculated outcome of system design, rather than operational failure. To understand why they sit here, we must look behind the stillness and examine the forces that rebuilt the American railroad. A standard modern mainline locomotive is a marvel of heavy engineering designed to operate almost continuously under extreme stress for up to 30 years. The machines parked along the Benson siding are not small yard switchers or outdated museum relics. These are active, high-horsepower road units, primarily General Electric AC-4400 CWs and Electromotive Division SD-70 ACEs. Each of these steel giants weighs more than 400,000 pounds. Inside their frames sits a 16-cylinder diesel engine, a prime mover that does not drive the wheels directly, but instead spins a massive alternator to generate electricity for traction motors mounted on the axles. They produce up to 4,400 horsepower each, generating immense tractive effort. A small consist of 3 or 4 of these units can haul 20,000 tons of cargo across continental divides, enduring freezing mountain passes and baking deserts without stopping. They are built for endless, heavy work. Their cooling fans are designed to roar constantly. Their air compressors are built to cycle day and night. Their traction motors are engineered to run hot under load. When these machines are operating normally, they represent the peak of land-based hauling power. The ground vibrates for miles around them, but here in the Arizona sand, that immense physical capacity is completely bottled up. The silence of these specific models is what makes the scene so jarring to anyone familiar with rail operations. Seeing a single 4,400 horsepower locomotive sitting idle in a yard for a few days suggests a brief maintenance window. Seeing 300 of them parked end to end, with their exhaust stacks covered and their engines cold, is a physical contradiction. These machines were manufactured to run, to pull, and to wear out through millions of miles of heavy service, not to rest silently in the desert heat. The choice of the Sonoran Desert is a calculated exercise in atmospheric preservation. Rust, the primary enemy of steel machinery, requires moisture to form. In Benson, Arizona, the natural environment fights this chemical breakdown. Average annual precipitation here is roughly 3 inches, and relative humidity consistently hovers below 30%. This dry AIR protects the complex copper wiring, electronic control cabinets, and steel engine blocks from the destructive oxidation that would rapidly decay them in wetter regions of the country. This climate makes open-air storage highly effective. The logic mirrors the nearby military aerospace storage at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, where retired aircraft sit preserved by the same dry air. For a railroad, the desert acts as an engineering control, slowing physical degradation without the need for climate-controlled buildings. The physical geography minimizes the cost of holding these assets. The 3-mile line sits entirely on Union Pacific's proprietary right-of-way at milepost 1032 of the Lordsburg subdivision. Because the railroad already owns this flat, level ground, they avoid the expenses of leasing third-party land or clogging active classification yards. The level desert floor easily supports the immense weight of these 400,000-pound machines without requiring specialized track reinforcement or structural foundations. By parking the fleet here, the railroad avoids the cost of indoor warehousing. The location serves as a technical solution to an asset preservation problem, driven by geography, chemistry, and direct cost control. This 3-mile line represents the deliberate, calculated outcome of an operating doctrine that restructured the entire North American rail network. This management philosophy has a name: precision scheduled railroading. The architect of this system was E. Hunter Harrison, a polarizing rail executive who spent decades reshaping the industry. Harrison began refining his methods in the early 1990s at the Illinois Central Railroad. He rejected the long-standing practice of holding freight cars in yards until a full train could be assembled, replacing it with rigid, scheduled departures. More importantly, Harrison championed the consolidation of cargo into fewer, significantly longer trains. Under his direction, traditional 7,000-foot freight consists were combined into massive trains stretching up to 15,000 feet. This shift changed the mathematical requirement for locomotive power. When a railroad runs a single 3-mile-long train instead of 3 separate shorter ones, the demand for active locomotives drops immediately. The Benson siding is the physical manifestation of this reduction. By consolidating routes, closing redundant classification yards, and squeezing more work out of a smaller pool of active equipment, Class 1 railroads created a massive surplus of heavy road units. Union Pacific parked this fleet in the Sonoran Desert because the network was redesigned to operate without them. The stored engines are a structural byproduct of this design. Harrison's model turned the locomotive from a tool of continuous transportation into an asset that must either run at absolute capacity or sit completely sidelined. The silence of these 300 units is the direct result of a corporate strategy that prioritizes asset performance over excess capacity, parking $1 billion in steel to keep the rest of the network running lean. Under the traditional operating model, North American railroads functioned like a conveyor belt, dispatching trains as soon as cargo was loaded. This system produced a steady flow of moderately sized trains, typically averaging 7,000 feet in length. To transport 21,000 feet of containerized freight across the country, a carrier would run 3 separate trains, each requiring its own crew, its own scheduled departure slot, and its own dedicated set of locomotives. If each of those 3 movements required a standard, consist of 3 active units, the total operational demand for that cargo was 9 locomotives. The new doctrine restructured this basic physical equation. By consolidating those 3 separate movements into a single, massive train stretching 15,000 feet, the mechanical requirements of the network shifted. Pulling a single supersized train does not require a simple tripling of horsepower. Because of the physics of rail friction, aerodynamic drag, and momentum, a combined 15,000-foot train can be pulled by a single, coordinated set of 4 or 5 locomotives. By running 1 consolidated train instead of 3, the railroad immediately reduces its active locomotive requirement from 9 units to 5. The remaining 4 units are instantly rendered surplus. When this operational math is scaled across a transcontinental network that spans thousands of miles of track, the impact is compounding. The structural demand for active mainline power drops by thousands of units. This approach prioritizes absolute asset utilization, choosing to keep the active fleet as small and hard-working as possible. Any locomotive on the active roster must run continuously at full capacity. Anything else is viewed as costly, redundant slack. In this lean operating environment, there is no room for a loose buffer of active engines sitting in local terminals. Locomotives are either pulling maximum tonnage trains or they are completely sidelined. This operational design naturally generates a massive pool of dormant horsepower. The silent line in the desert is the direct mechanical consequence of this transition, acting as a permanent physical holding zone for the assets that are no longer needed to keep the simplified network moving. In 1993, E. Hunter Harrison proved the financial viability of this model at the Illinois Central Railroad, driving its operating ratio down from nearly 98% to 60%. The operating ratio measures operating expenses as a percentage of revenue. A lower percentage means lower overhead and greater profitability. When Harrison implemented the system at Canadian National in 2003 and Canadian Pacific in 2012, the financial results followed. Canadian Pacific's operating ratio plunged from over 80% to 58.6% within 4 years. When CSX adopted the system in 2017, its operating ratio hit 56.8%, a record low for a Class 1 carrier. For Union Pacific, the transition yielded similar corporate success, with its operating ratio falling from 71% in the early 2010s to 59.9% by 2024. This systematic reduction in operating costs directly improved margins, pushing earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization into historic territory. Wall Street responded with immediate enthusiasm. railroad stock prices routinely climbed 15 to 20%, following earnings reports that featured these structural gains. Activist investors and hedge funds pressured remaining carriers to adopt the model, demanding high margins and larger dividend payouts. On paper, the strategy was an industrial success story. It transformed capital-intensive, slow-moving networks into streamlined, cash-generating enterprises. Corporate boards aligned executive compensation and performance bonuses directly with these operating ratio targets. By reducing active fleets, consolidating yards, and running longer trains, executives generated shareholder value. The model proved that a railroad could move equivalent freight volume with fewer physical assets, less labor, and a fraction of the capital investment. This was the economic logic that justified parking hundreds of active locomotives. From an accounting perspective, an engine sitting silently in the Arizona desert was not a wasted resource, but a sign of optimized asset utilization. In the spring of 2022, the limits of this hyper-optimized design collided with a recovering global economy as factories, farms, and energy plants ramped up production. Freight volumes returned to the rail network, but the spare capacity needed to absorb this sudden surge was gone. The yards were closed, the crews had been laid off, and the extra locomotives were parked end to end in the desert. Without any operational buffer, the system began to fracture under pressure. Shippers immediately felt the weight of a gridlocked network. Grain shipments stalled in the Midwest, coal deliveries to power plants fell behind, and chemical manufacturers faced supply interruptions. In response to the growing congestion, Union Pacific began issuing unilateral shipping embargoes, temporary service suspensions that forced customers to find alternative, more expensive transport. By 2023, Union Pacific had issued over 1,000 embargoes, a volume that exceeded all other major North American railroads combined. The service collapse triggered direct federal intervention. In April 2022, the Surface Transportation Board convened emergency public hearings under Docket EP 770 to address the systemic breakdown. Rail executives were forced to sit before regulators and frustrated shippers to explain why a multi-billion-dollar network could no longer guarantee basic, reliable delivery. When commissioners demanded to know why hundreds of functional locomotives sat idle in places like Benson, while shippers faced debilitating delays, executives defended the line as a necessary surge capacity buffer. But the hearing revealed a deeper, structural vulnerability. The massive financial gains of the previous decade had come at the expense of network resilience. To drive operating ratios down, the carriers had stripped out the very slack required to handle economic volatility. The quiet line of steel in the Arizona sand was no longer just an administrative triumph of asset management. It was a physical monument to a system running too lean to bend without breaking. The ultimate reason this massive fleet continues to wait in the Sonoran dry air lies in a lasting structural shift in the American energy sector. Many of the heavy-haul locomotives parked along the Benson siding, specifically the General Electric AC 4400CW and Electromotive Division SD70 ACE units, were manufactured for one dominant purpose: moving coal. For decades, the Powder River Basin of Wyoming and Montana served as the beating heart of American coal production, supplying up to 40% of the nation's supply. To haul these incredibly heavy payloads, railroads built massive fleets of high-horsepower, AC traction locomotives. These machines spent their lives dragging unit trains of over 100 cars across the Western Plains. But the demand base supporting this massive logistics operation has experienced a permanent contraction. National coal production dropped 12% in 2024 alone, down to 512 million tons. In the Powder River Basin, output slipped to 230.4 million tons in 2023, down 7 million tons from the prior year. By the second quarter of 2024, the Association of American Railroads recorded a 20% drop in coal carloads, marking the lowest first-half totals since record-keeping began. For Union Pacific, this energy transition was reflected in its own ledger, with coal shipping volumes plunging 20% in recent periods. When coal plants shut down and utilities transition to natural gas and renewable energy, the traffic does not return. This represents a permanent market disappearance. The 4,000 horsepower workhorses that once ran back and forth between Wyoming mines and Midwestern power plants suddenly lost their primary assignment. They did not become obsolete due to mechanical failure, they simply ran out of cargo to pull. This permanent loss of coal traffic is the first major demand-side force that explains why these locomotives remain parked end-to-end in the desert. Stripped of their historic purpose and waiting for a future that may never arrive. Federal emission regulations change the economics of fleet renewal. Under the Environmental Protection Agency's Tier 4 rules, new locomotives must achieve a 90% reduction in particulate matter and nitrogen oxides. Meeting these standards requires complex exhaust after-treatment systems that added $1.5 million to the price of every new unit, pushing the total cost of a fresh Tier 4 locomotive to over $3 million. Faced with these steep capital requirements, Class 1 railroads adjusted their investment strategies. Instead of purchasing expensive new power, they turned to rebuild programs. A worn-out older locomotive can be fully modernized and rebuilt for roughly half the cost of a new Tier 4 model. Union Pacific acted on this cost gap by launching a $1.2 billion program to rebuild 1,700 of its older AC 4400 CW units. This strategic choice dried up the market for new mainline locomotives. By the end of 2022, write-downs on Tier 4 assets across the industry reached $935 million, indicating a near total freeze in new build procurement. This shift altered the natural life cycle of the fleet. Because older locomotives are continuously rebuilt and modernized rather than retired, the market pathway for clearing out older surplus power has vanished. The reserve in the desert is easy to maintain and cheap to preserve, while the financial incentive to replace it with brand new equipment has disappeared. The machines along the Lordsburg subdivision stay parked because the economic bridge to the next generation of locomotives has broken down. Scrapping these locomotives would force Union Pacific to recognize an immediate, massive write-down on its balance sheet. A single modern heavy road unit carries a book value between $1.5 million and $3 million. Selling that same locomotive to a metal recycler yields a scrap value of only $150,000 to $250,000. Taking that path means locking in an immediate capital loss of up to $2.7 million per engine. For a fleet of 300 locomotives, the resulting write-down would instantly erase hundreds of millions of dollars in corporate asset value. This is a severe hit to quarterly earnings that no railroad executive wants to explain to Wall Street. By contrast, keeping the fleet in the Arizona desert is remarkably inexpensive. Because the siding sits entirely on proprietary railroad property, Union Pacific pays zero land leasing fees. The physical overhead of desert storage, including security patrols, protective wraps, and basic engineering preservation, costs roughly $10,000 to $15,000 per unit annually. Technicians perform basic preventative maintenance, such as monthly battery charging, diagnostic checks, and regular oil circulation for about $5,000 per locomotive each year. This low-cost preservation turns a line of idle steel into a highly valuable financial instrument. In the language of corporate accounting, this reserve represents optional capacity rather than dead capital. Holding these machines intact preserves a rare surge capacity. If freight demand spikes, or if commodity markets shift rapidly, the railroad can reactivate these high-horsepower units within weeks instead of waiting years to order and build brand new models. The 3-mile line in the Sonoran Desert is a highly rational, calculated holding strategy, where parking $1 billion of assets in the sand is simply the smartest financial move on the corporate ledger. The 3-mile line of yellow steel near Benson is a visible balance sheet parked in the desert sand. Every engine represents a calculated, highly deliberate decision to hold physical assets on the books rather than write them off. By preserving these highly capable machines along the Lordsburg subdivision, Union Pacific retains massive operational optionality. The railroad keeps its capacity intact, holding hundreds of thousands of horsepower in reserve, ready to reactivate these units when the market demands them. This strategy reflects a deliberate asset management philosophy, treating the idle fleet as a valuable financial instrument and a strategic reserve. This physical assembly serves as a dynamic economic gauge. The length of this line acts as a real-time, physical readout of the American supply chain, a live index of industrial demand that is visible from orbit. The constant changes in the size of this fleet match the cycles of the broader economy, offering a reliable, alternative measure of macroeconomic health. When the line of stored engines begins to shrink, it reveals a tightening logistics network. A contracting reserve indicates that factories are increasing production, agricultural shipments are rising, and intermodal yards are filling. To move this cargo, the railroad must pull these heavy road units back into active service, returning them to the main line. A smaller line indicates high fleet utilization, intense operational pressure, and robust macroeconomic activity. Conversely, when the line grows longer, it signals accumulating slack and systemic stress. An expanding assembly shows that freight demand has softened, consumer spending has cooled, or major commodity sectors are contracting. The railroad parks its primary power because there are no longer enough loaded cars to pull, converting active, capital-intensive machinery into quiet inventory. The 3-mile wall of steel becomes a physical manifestation of industrial friction, a heavy warning of wider economic deceleration. Ultimately, this desert siding is a readable industrial instrument. The stillness of these 300 giant machines represents a strategic buffer against global volatility. Tracking this remote stretch of track in Benson, Arizona, provides a live, physical barometer of the national economy, where the physical momentum of the continental freight system is written in 3 miles of silent steel. It indicates where the economy is heading tomorrow, reflecting immediate reality before it ever appears in quarterly reports. This 3-mile line is no graveyard. It is a physical barometer of the global supply chain, a corporate balance sheet visible from orbit. When these steel giants stir and the line shrinks, the gears of global commerce are accelerating. When it grows, the economic engine is faltering. Keep your eyes on the desert. The future of American trade is written in this silent, shifting line. What do you think lies ahead? Let us know in the comments.